Does an optimal BMI exist? If it's okay to have an overweight BMI, so 25 or above, if you have extra weight from muscle, if BMI is racist. First, we'll start with, is there an optimal BMI? Here we get back into my intellectual irritations here. We'll start with optimal BMI, question mark. Oops. So I get asked this question from a few smart people. Professor Easter asked me this question, and I have much more of a philosophical response, as I do with most things, or a lot of hardcore scientists do, I suppose, as well. Someone asks, is there an optimal BMI? First, I ask, what the hell does optimal mean? If optimal means the state at which you thrive, then thriving means the state at which you are optimal. When people have these conversations about, well, what is optimal? I can tell you that I answer with optimal supposes an optimum. You can only have something optimal if you know an optimum exists, and you know that optimum, because once you've reached it, then you know. And so to ask the question, what is an optimal BMI? You have to, before you can even ask that question, go beyond what does optimal mean and actually towards tell me the optimum, and I can tell you. Hopefully that makes sense from a conceptual standpoint, because when you peel back the logic even one layer, the question ends up causing a lot of confusion and a ruckus. So is there an optimal BMI? A smart person would say, okay, an optimal BMI for what? And really annoying people says, what the hell does optimal mean? And then the really annoying person says, if you ask what is the optimum, then you presume optimal exists. And so you already start the argument with the supposition with zero validation. And so now this goes every which direction, which we have seen in the public health sort of discourse. So somebody submitted this question. I go off on that tangent because somebody submitted that question to Easter in particular, Professor Easter, and Professor Easter then says what an astute person would say, well, an optimal for what? For health or longevity? So some evidence suggested a BMI between 20 and 22 is ideal for living the longest based on your height, okay? That if you have a BMI between 20 and 22, those people tend to live longer compared to people in other categories. And so I have this conversation. I love to have this sort of conversation with physicians and coaches, etc., because they say they want to live a very long time. Many people do. And I said, do you know what the 150-year-old man looks like? Blind, deaf, mute, crippled. Just you still age. And so these sorts of questions then open up another can of worms of lifespan, how long your heart keeps beating, versus health span, versus work span, versus youth span. And so we can segregate this out all day long in the context of, well, if a person lives to 120, but they turn into a vegetable at 80, do you want to live to 120? Well, if you want to live as long as possible, then yes. What if that person who turned into a vegetable at 80 got sick at 60? That means you've lived literally 50% of your life in a prison. And if a person stays useful until 75 and dies at 76, have they lived longer? So I like to have these sorts of conversations on a daily basis when discussing things like longevity, because living longer for the sake of living longer tends to sort of overlook a lot of the practical implications of living a long time, because people really want to stay functional and healthy and youthful for a long time rather than keep my heart beating for as many beats as possible forever. And those ask two very different questions, because so many people live to 100 plus and maybe they turned into the equivalent of a vegetable at 80 something. So looking at the different spans of life, if somebody spends more time of their total life as useful, even if they live a shorter life, somebody could make the argument that they live longer, depending on the sort of frame you take. So I like to ask those sorts of questions. So to get back on track here, Michael Easter has a BMI of 23.7, long and lean guy. By anyone else's standards, he looks thin as a rail. By BMI standards, it puts him in basically smack dab in the middle of normal weight. Just to give you an idea of how culture has shifted for so long, that we have confused what looks normal to us versus what has the lowest probability of disease. Because normal has changed a lot in the past 150 years. And so a lot of people that look terribly skinny, calling out grandmas, might actually have the perfect status, in quotes. Can we know? No, because that would mean that we knew the optimal. So that's something that I see all the time, that a person who looks skinnier than you want them to look now is skinny or is underweight. And if a person looks fatter than you want them to look, that makes them fat. That varies, or rather that speaks a different language than your height to weight ratio in the context of where you lie in the range of your probabilities of disease over time. Very different, because that confuses the laws of culture with the laws of nature. Very different things. So Professor Easter's BMI is 23.7, and he found for him that being at the high end of normal is the sweet spot for him for endurance, strength, durability, for the stuff that he likes to do. Does a lot of outdoorsy stuff. He likes to carry 100-pound backpacks and hike up up mountains and do all sorts of crazy stuff. And for him, having a little bit of extra body weight makes his life better and more convenient for the activities he does. Now we get closer to optimal. Maybe. So running at that weight for him actually takes stress off of his joints. It probably means that he has less pain when he carries a little bit more beef, which I've also seen correlate quite a bit. So if you want to find the ideal BMI for your sport, for instance, that asks a different question. Look at how the athletes are built, then make some estimations. For instance, if you look at all the best basketball players, maybe you can look at the mean median mode of their BMIs and see, okay, the height to weight ratio for somebody in this sport that performs the best lands here. That gives you somewhere to look. Weight class sports like wrestling or powerlifting have similar sorts of situations. If you wrestle at 250 pounds, do those guys walk in at 5 feet tall? No, they could, they will lose. And so now you start to look at, well, if I have a sport, if I compete in a sport with a weight class, if you compare weight classes, if you compare the athletes in weight classes in a weight class sport, heavier people get taller. You see a direct correlation between the weight class and the height. The heavier the weight class, the bigger the person, the taller the person. And the smaller the weight class, the smaller the person. When you group it all together. This indicates less that weight in and of itself matters and indicates more that a combination of weight and height give a performance advantage. Now we have some use for BMI. If you want to look at BMI in the context of, well, what sort of things do I have influence over that might improve my performance in a given sport? You can look up that data. Now, that also raises the question of, well, if I have a higher or lower BMI, would that affect maybe my health and longevity 50 years from now? Absolutely, it might. And so now we get into more of a philosophical discussion of, well, if I wanted to live to 150, I would have just chosen to be born as a tiny Japanese lady and live up in the mountains. If I wanted to live forever, I would have chosen that. And I say that tongue in cheek, half serious and half joking, because genetics do play a role. The people that live the longest, they tend to have the smallest bodies, okay? And the people that tend to live the shortest periods of times tend to have much larger bodies, larger hearts, et cetera, et cetera. What if you have an overweight BMI, but my extra weight comes from muscle mass? Right? Because this BMI stuff just has to do with fat people. Fat people get sick. Well, I could tell you that the equation for BMI looks something like how much you weigh divided by the square of your height in meters, not how much muscle you have in the square of your height in meters. Just to clarify. So what if the extra weight comes from muscle? Well, research does consistently show that if you have very little muscle mass, it has its own health problems. You look up sarcopenia. You also have sarcopenic obesity, where people who have a lot of body fat and also a very low amount of muscle mass at the same time. All sorts of interesting things starts to occur. In that instance, I would actually argue, does fatness cause illness? No. I will tell you that if you have a super tiny amount of muscle, that might cause illness because you have metabolism and glucose disposal and interesting things like that, okay? Mostly that the amount of muscle you have, if you have a training level of 0, it correlates to how strong you are. So if you have two people that have 0 training and one person has more muscle than the other, the person with more muscle has more strength. Once you include training into this, that gets interesting, but really, how many people on earth lift weights? Like less than 1% on a regular basis, enough to build muscle mass considerably. And so you can make direct correlations between muscle mass and strength pretty easily because of the total amount of people that train on purpose. So having low amount of muscle mass means low amount of strength, and a low amount of strength does cause problems for longevity, where what causes, in quotes, most people to die? They break a major bone, then they get bedridden, then they die. You break a hip, you break a leg, you break something, and that something lands you in bed. And what happens when you land in bed? What little bit muscle you have wastes away, which then increases the chances of injury again, which then causes issues with appetite and hygiene and chance of infection, et cetera, et cetera. And so a lot of people that end up getting major surgeries or fixing broken bones or replacing joints above the age of 60, their death correlates almost directly with that. Yeah, Michelle, lift weights, get some strong ass bones. So I hold the position that, well, if you can keep your bones from breaking, that alone puts way more of an advantage in most other circumstances for staying functional and living longer. Swedish researchers found that the strongest among a massive group of men of all ages were least likely to die over 2 decades. So basically they took a massive group of people of all ages, they took all of their muscle mass, and 20 years later they said, how many of you died? And the ones that died had on average less muscle mass than the ones that lived. So taking a pool of all ages. So this includes things like injury too, freak accidents, etc. So the effect held even when the researchers removed any cardiovascular benefits from strength training. And lifting weights does improve your cardiovascular system, at least a little bit initially. And this means that making yourself stronger and having more denser bones keeps you alive longer. If you fall down the stairs, you know how many people would die if they fell down the stairs? A lot. You know your chances of dying when you fall down the stairs if you spent 10 years lifting weights? Much less. You would laugh because you have bones of steel, okay? So gym culture now has kind of unfortunately taken this data and ran with it because they've used it to argue that packing on huge amounts of muscle is healthy. Because if these people have more muscle and they live longer, well then more muscle means I live more forever and ever. And this confuses BMI a little bit. The body mass index rather than the muscle mass index. So we need to understand something important about the studies on muscle and health. So those studies don't compare normal weight people with bodybuilders who are lean or have an overweight or obese BMI. So most of these studies compare people who are sarcopenic, meaning they have low amounts of muscle mass compared to the population rather than high or normal amounts. So they have dangerously low levels of muscle at the same weight. So this means if you stay a BMI of 22.5 and have more muscle at the same BMI, now you start seeing benefits measurably. So in other words, trying to look like The Rock to improve your health is a lot like looking at data on how 1 drink a day seems to be good for your health and then assuming 7 drinks a day must be even healthier. Hopefully that makes sense. Does The Rock burn the candle at the other end? Yes, he does. And the trade-off makes sense for him as one of the most influential people on planet Earth. Signing a contract with yourself to die of a heart attack to have the sort of influence that he has, I think most people would make that trade. Now, because of the way that he gets presented, makes him look like a beacon of health, and he might be a beacon of health, so to speak, right now. When you have that much muscle mass and that height, you've got the heart the size of a catcher's glove. Look at Great Danes and Chihuahuas. We'll get that to a second. So the truth is that we really don't know if it's healthy to have muscle beyond what you get at a normal BMI. So with the sort of experience I have, I'll throw in my overt bias that you could only make yourself obese with muscle mass if you take steroids. And steroids on their own have their own health risks. And so you ask, the royal you, that asks a silly question. Well, if I made myself obese with muscle mass, well, that would mean I would have to take all these drugs to do that. And so you ask a different question because those drugs do affect other body systems. You also sign a contract that I'll die of a heart attack. So that question I consider moot because does that population even exist? And I argue no. Do those people exist once in a while? Yeah, we probably see them in the NFL or the gold medalist Olympians. Okay, thanks. Maybe. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. It would take dangerous drugs to get your muscle mass high enough to put you into an overweight category with muscle mass, really making the question moot, okay? And I say this as my opinion, so I can take the blame for the most part. We don't know if it's healthy to have muscle mass beyond a normal BMI because where's the data? Exactly. And the data that does exist really only exists in people that use dangerous drugs. So does it make sense to spend resources on something like this? No, because tax dollars don't go towards stuff like this on a multinational scale. Research continues on this. People think that we've stopped researching body fat and body weight and height. Good grief. So the one source Professor Easter talked to said that most men that lift weights and have a BMI in the overweight category carry too much fat. In other words, if you have a BMI of 30 and you lift weights, you could probably lose fat to a BMI of 25 and still have the same amount of muscle mass. Does that mean that your muscle contributes to your obesity classification? No. Even the best natural bodybuilders in the world get on stage at less than 200 pounds, okay? Which puts you at the slightly overweight category most of the time for the height. The best in the world, by the way. So basically, it's very hard to be sufficiently lean and muscular to fall into the obese category, and the majority of those people will require steroids, and that again moots the point. So Professor Easter goes on to say that his friend Trevor Kashey, me, biochemist and former disease researcher, for those of you who didn't know, I spent quite a bit of time doing cancer research and a couple of other interesting things. He put me in his book, The Comfort Crisis, and we had very fun conversations about this. And I said, consider intra-species variation. So that means within within the same species. If you have two healthy, fully grown animals of the same species, the smaller one will probably have a longer lifespan. Let us consider dogs, my favorite one. So think of a Great Dane, the big, gentle giants, and then look at Chihuahuas, the tiny Tasmanian devils of doom, okay? The Chihuahua will live more than twice as long. Both dogs. Even if you keep them both optimal and healthy and all this other stuff we talk about, the Chihuahua will still live to 20, as angry as ever, even if all its teeth fall out, okay? And there are several reasons for something like this, like oxidative damage, inflammation, organ stress, joint stress, etc. And this makes BMI so important. So meatheads will argue that BMI is irrelevant because it puts me in the overweight category. It called me fat, therefore it is wrong. Pretty standard sort of response to any classification, even backed by statistics or not. And good on anyone to push back. What does it mean to push back though? To verify and substantiate the claims rather than just say no, all right? The difference between obstinance and skepticism. So they say BMI is irrelevant to me because I lift weights, and look at me, I'm not overweight, I'm just super jacked. And I take the position that huge amounts of muscle mass cause different and probably worse strain on your organs compared to an equal amount of fat. So muscle is metabolically active, and when you damage it, it goes into your bloodstream, causing kidney problems, etc., etc. Check out rhabdomyolysis if you feel like checking your spelling skills. So muscle is metabolically active and more demanding, whereas fat, when stored outside of the abdomen, stays benign. And you see these differences with women, by the way. So women have different sort of BMI classification risks because women store their fat in their arms, in their chest, in their legs, and in their butt. And men, it just goes right into a freaking bowling ball in the gut. And that ends up making a big difference, in my opinion, okay? And again, BMI calculations account for this already. So the difference between being overweight with lean mass versus overweight with fat mass is what organs get stressed out and fail first. So a huge amounts of muscle mass means a ton of vascular strain. That means more stress on your heart, more stress on your kidneys probably. Huge amounts of fat means tons of visceral fat, which means it puts a little stress on your liver and your pancreatic. You have pancreatic issues. So let's say you have a bodybuilder and a couch potato who are both 300 pounds. Both are going to die younger than necessary, but the bodybuilder will have a heart attack and the obese person will have diabetic nephropathy. They will still both die earlier. They will just die of different things. And Easter goes ahead and throws me under the bus and says, Dr. Kashey is also a 250-pound bodybuilder. So I asked, well, aren't you basically a Great Dane? And I said, yeah, but who says I want to be a Chihuahua? Okay. And this has to do with the angry sort of that I differentiate how useful of a life you have versus how long your heart beats. And I take the position personally, and I will put it on nobody, that a person that stays useful for 80 years and dies at 85 lives longer than a person that stays useful for 60 years and dies at 100. And I will fight that to the death because it will kill me. Okay. And I genuinely feel that way. Totally a life in your years versus years in your life sort of argument that I keep. How long can you stay healthy differs from how long you live. Big difference. How long you stay young differs from how long you live. Imagine if you could stay 20 and die at 80. And so from a scientific perspective, from a philosophical perspective, the time, energy, resources to extend a lifespan, I think asks the wrong questions because we will still continue to age even if we live longer. The 150-year-old person looks exactly how you would imagine. And so it ends up asking and answering different questions than we really want answered. We want to stay young for longer rather than get older and older. And these sorts of philosophical conversations end up help us ask and answer the questions we want to direct our own lives, in my opinion. Because like I said, if I wanted to live forever, I would have just been born a little Japanese woman and moved to the mountains. You can starve yourself and go and you can do that and you'll probably live longer. So Professor Easter also followed up with his friend Mike Roussel, a PhD nutritionist who lifts weights and he is built like a brick for sure. And he said that he plans on transitioning into what he calls longevity weight. So a lot of people into the bodybuilding game, weightlifting game, they understand that this has a cost. And so as soon as it is started, you've kind of take advantage of all the benefits you can of making yourself big and strong, then you start to downsize yourself on purpose. And a lot of professionals have taken to that. And if you look at the anecdotal evidence, which I have seen in bodybuilding, especially where professional bodybuilders drop like flies after about the age of 45, you can see that the men in particular who end up downsizing, who shrinking their bodies after they have retired, live to normal ages. is. So pretty neat. So muscle is good, but at a certain point, it becomes more of a burden. And Mike Roussel said this, and for your joints, right? Falling over, you have a higher chance of getting osteoarthritis if you beat the crap out of yourself at the gym all the time, especially with the way some of these guys lift, which then affects the way you walk, which then increases the chances you fall over and break a bone, et cetera, et cetera. So all this stuff has costs and benefits. Having a ton of muscle mass also affects your blood pressure, which by and large, in my opinion, causes a vast majority of problems. Because does having a high blood pressure hurt? No. If you have something that hurts and high blood pressure at the same time, you've already died. If you have high blood pressure and they go, one day you go, oh, my lower back hurts, your kidneys have already melted. So blood pressure, just as pro tip, I consider the single most important health metric that you can measure at home and moderate at home. Can you feel when your blood pressure goes up and down? No. You can make correlations like I get real mad or whatever, but really your hypothalamus ends up regulating for that, and you can live at much higher blood pressures. Meanwhile, every time your heart beats, your cardiovascular system gets sadder and sadder. You get little tears. All sorts of interesting things happen that I would wish on nobody, but really cool to read about. Oh, as an aside. So the data suggests that those two things are correct, the blood pressure and the muscle mass. And so one review actually looked at 53 different studies on the longevity of athletes, right? How long these professional athletes lived, and found that endurance and mixed sport athletes, which means they require strength and endurance, they lived longer than the average person. The sports that included strength and conditioning versus pure strength, like powerlifters, etc. So they have stronger bones and they have more reliable cardiovascular systems. The longest living athletes were small European cyclists, okay? Little people on bicycles live the longest, more mountain people, okay? Making yourself tiny and living on a mountain, it forces you to walk up the mountain all the time. You walk up the mountain to build your heart, you walk down the mountain to build your bones. The shortest living athletes were big Finnish powerlifters, okay? Behemoth men, they fall over at 50. I just made that up, okay? They fall over much younger. And this finding of the smaller dog lives longer even applies within specific sports. Very cool. So we have lots of data on professional athletes in the United States because of all sorts of implications, obviously. So for example, Major League Baseball players with a lower BMI, they lived longer than their teammates who had higher BMI. So even within the same sport, the smaller boys live longer. So in short, if you want to be super muscular, great. It has its own set of cultural, social, and performance benefits. Look at The Rock, okay? Classic example. He reaps all sorts of benefits from the way he looks and how he does it. The research shows that, at least for longevity, for living longer, you'd make yourself better off by making yourself strong, muscular, and lean within a normal BMI. And unless you have a long history of steroid use and bodybuilding, that really just means that you can bodybuild, you can still bodybuild, and you have approximately 0% chance of building so much muscle that it hurts your organ systems. And when you get fat, you get stronger. And when you get stronger, you think you've built muscle. I'll just leave it there, okay? The 20 pounds of muscle mass that somebody could put on, if you stripped all the fat away, would actually make you normal weight. Hopefully that makes sense. So unless you get into steroids and all sorts of other muscle building things, which if you do, I suggest you talk to someone who knows about this stuff about it first. Otherwise, stay away. That, again, it moots the point. So that now leads us to our next interesting question of, is BMI racist? And this has all sorts of interesting implications, because a lot of data exists, obviously, about health outcomes and race. And it fuels a lot of public debates about health. Does BMI have anything to do with it? So outlets like the Scientific American, Good Housekeeping, the Huffington Post, all huge media outlets that have big umbrella, okay? They run stories exploring whether BMI is racist. And so the idea is that BMI cutoffs are based on socially constructed beauty standards, and that because of the initial data used to construct BMI came from white men, okay? Many historically marginalized groups have been hurt. So this sort of bias does exist. The most people that had health insurance or life insurance when MetLife originally made this data 100 years ago, most of them white men, okay? Yes, 100%. It started there. Did it end there? No. I feel sad even saying it. It started there, yes. Did it end there? No. Just like any other science, it starts with rats. It starts with bacteria. It starts with bacteria, it goes to rats, it goes to pigeons, it goes to monkeys. It starts somewhere, okay? So the implications and the takeaways from the articles are that certain groups of people, if not everyone, should ignore BMI. Well, because it started with a bunch of rich white dudes, everyone should ignore it. Never mind the 50 million people and 100 years worth of research in between. So it's true that different races absolutely have different disease risk risks at different BMIs. That data exists. What substantiates it? The correlative, just like BMI, okay? For example, a few studies have found that Asian populations have more complications from obesity at a lower BMI. Smaller people, if they get fatter, it hits them harder. Bigger people, if they get fatter, whatever. The size of your frame gives you flex, from what I have seen anecdotally, okay? So they end up staying a lower body weight for longer. If they happen to get obese, it causes more problems faster. Bigger people tend to get much bigger. They have a little more flex. Again, from what I have seen versus pulling out any specific data. So this means that a person of Asian descent, whatever that really means these days, okay, with an obese BMI would be at more risk of a disease compared to someone of another race who had the same BMI, which is why the World Health Organization adjusted obesity cutoffs for Asians. So does that mean you throw BMI out the window? No, it means you look at the Asian person BMI. They had such a large difference, statistically speaking, it justified having, ironically enough, segregating it by race, okay? And so by actually discriminating by race with the data, they can now make a separate BMI scale for that population. So some doctors also suggest that Black women could be marginalized for inappropriately diagnosed with things because they tend to have slightly higher BMIs compared to white and Hispanic women, even though they carry less body fat. So Black women have a little more muscle mass on them. And generally speaking, like most women, they store their fat at the edges rather than in the center. And so both of these things combined really, have a positive impact on their metabolic health. And so at least one study has also found that Black women could be healthier at a higher BMI. That may or may not mean anything in particular. And so the Fatima Cody at Stanford, an obesity research, went from Stanford, moved to Harvard, proposed further adjustments to BMI. Good. I hope they do. Okay. When we get enough data, we make adjustments. Welcome to science. And so this idea that, well, we have this BMI scale and it doesn't work for these people, therefore we throw the whole damn thing out. It throws the baby out with the bathwater. We've kept researching ever since this thing came into existence. And we will continue researching so long as we have the capability to research it. And the more we learn, the more, ironically enough, the more we can discriminate. So I will leave it there. Thank you so much for your patience with my angry ranting on BMI. Thank you so much for learning. Stay rational. And until next time, Dr. Kashey, out.